My name is Gina Aubrey. I am 40 years old, and for 11 of those years I have worked as a paralegal, a legal helper, in a small town in Ohio. It is work that demands precision. You read contracts that most people would find incomprehensible. You sort through court filings, you organize statements and evidence, and make sure nothing gets missed. I have spent thousands of hours doing exactly that. And yet, for all those hours, nothing I ever read in a legal document could have prepared me for what my own sister tried to do to my daughter. I have raised Sophie alone since she was 7 years old. We have always been a team, just the two of us, building our life together one careful year at a time. She is 21 now, studying to become a nurse, and she is the best thing I have ever done. So when my sister Deborah decided that the grief of losing our mother was an opportunity, when she sat my daughter down in front of a hired lawyer with a stack of papers and told her it was a family healing session, I wanted to understand what she was really doing. She was betting that a 21-year-old girl who had just lost her grandmother would be too overwhelmed and too alone to fight back. She forgot about me. My mother, Ruth Aubrey, lived in a little yellow house on Maple Drive in Millbrook, Ohio. She taught third grade for 31 years and loved those children the way some people love their own. She retired at 63 and spent her last 9 years tending her garden, baking lemon bars for neighbors, and reading mystery novels on the front porch. She was not a complicated woman. She loved simple things, and she loved the people who showed up for her. She had 2 daughters. Deborah was 5 years older than me and had always been the one who filled a room. She was charming and quick and knew exactly what to say to make people like her instantly. Our father adored her. He called her his golden girl. He called me his quiet one, which was his gentle way of saying I was the other one. When he died 16 years ago, Deborah inherited most of what he left. I did not hold that against him. I understood, even then, that some people are easier to love loudly. But my mother watched. She never said much about it, but she was always watching. She saw that Deborah visited when she needed something and disappeared when she did not. She saw that I came because I wanted to sit with her, drink her coffee, hear about her garden. And when she got sick, when the mornings became harder and the grocery bags too heavy, she saw who appeared at the door. 2 years before she died, Sophie moved into the yellow house. Sophie was 19, working at a drugstore and paying her nursing school fees through government assistance. I wanted to help her more than I could. My paralegal salary in a small town does not stretch far, and I still had my own debts to manage. My mother had a spare room and an open heart, and what began as a practical arrangement became something much more. Sophie cooked dinner every night. She drove my mother to every doctor's appointment. She sat on the edge of the bed and read mystery novels aloud when my mother's hands became too shaky to hold the book. On the bad nights, Sophie did not go to her own room. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and slept there. That is the kind of person my daughter is. In those same 2 years, Deborah visited 3 times. Each visit, she moved through the house with her eyes on the walls and the furniture, the way someone walks through a property they are considering purchasing. On her second visit, she pulled me into the hallway while Mom was resting and asked whether Mom had updated her will recently. I told her I did not know. She said someone really ought to look into that, then poured herself a glass of wine and left before dinner was on the table. Sophie told me later that she had overheard Deborah in the backyard, on the phone with her husband Ray, talking about what the house might sell for. Sophie had quietly closed the window. I told Sophie not to worry. I told her to focus on her studies and on her grandmother, and that the right things would happen when the time came. I believed that. I had to. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It moved fast, the way that disease tends to. She died on a cold Tuesday in January. The nurse said she went peacefully, but I do not think anyone who watches their mother stop breathing would describe it that way. The funeral had 42 people in a church built for several hundred. Sophie stood beside me the entire time. Deborah arrived 20 minutes late in dark sunglasses she never removed. The following Thursday, the 3 of us sat in front of Harold Kimball's desk at his law office, the kind of room that smells like old carpet and Q House on Maple Drive, and $240,000 in savings to Sophie. There was one line I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It said, "To my granddaughter Sophie, Who was here when it mattered? Deborah received nothing. I watched her face. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She sat completely still, hands flat on her thighs, her expression something I can only describe as locked. She looked at Harold as though he had made a clerical error. When he asked for questions, she said no, stood up, put on her coat, and walked out without a word to either of us. That silence lasted exactly 2 days. She called Thursday night, her voice careful and rehearsed. She told me the will was not fair. She said our mother had not been thinking clearly. She said Sophie must have manipulated her because she was living there and had constant access. I sat on my bed and listened, and I could hear Ray in the background feeding her the words. I told her this had been Mom's choice, that the doctors had confirmed she was mentally sound throughout, and that the will was entirely legal. Deborah said she was the firstborn child, and she could not believe she had been left with nothing. Then she hung up. 2 hours later, Sophie called me, crying. Deborah had called her too. She told Sophie that their grandmother had been confused, and that Sophie owed it to the family, owed it to her grandmother's memory, to do the right thing and give up what she had been left. Sophie told me she just wanted the yelling to stop. She said she was thinking about giving the money back if it would end things. I told her she was not giving anything back. I told her that her grandmother had made a choice with full knowledge of what she was doing, and that surrendering it would not honor her. It would undo her. I told Sophie to trust me. She said she did. The next morning, I went to work early and sat down with Robert Webb, the senior attorney at the firm where I have worked for 9 years. Robert has seen more inheritance disputes than most judges. He drinks his coffee black and does not waste words. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said the will was strong and that Deborah would lose in court. But I told him I was not worried about court. I was worried about Sophie being worn down until she gave up just to have peace. Robert agreed to officially represent Sophie. He also suggested we request copies of our mother's bank records from the final year of her life. He said that if money had moved when it should not have, we needed to know. Before I left his office, I told Sophie one thing. If anyone asked her to sign anything, she was to call me immediately. She was not to read it, not to touch the pen. Just call. Robert called me 2 weeks later. He had a yellow envelope with 6 pages of bank statements inside, certain lines flagged with yellow stickers. There were 6 withdrawals from my mother's savings account totaling $15,000. All of them occurred during the period when my mother was too ill to leave her bed. I looked at the signatures on the withdrawal forms. I knew my mother's handwriting well. She wrote in a thin, tilted script that was distinctly hers. These signatures were upright and overworked, the handwriting of someone trying very hard to copy something rather than write it naturally. The last withdrawal was dated 9 days before she died, at a point when she could barely hold a glass of water. Robert told me that forging signatures on financial documents is a serious crime. He asked if I wanted to involve the police. I said not yet. I wanted to wait until Deborah committed to something she could not walk back from. I took the documents home, made copies, and locked them in my briefcase. Deborah spent the following weeks working the family, like a campaign. She called our Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda and all the cousins with stories she had honed carefully. Sophie had manipulated a sick woman. I was helping Sophie because I wanted the money for myself. By the end of the 2nd week, my phone had gone quiet. People were beginning to believe her. My cousin Ellen, one of the fairest people in our family, called me and asked gently if any of it was true. I told her the truth plainly. I told her that Sophie had been the one sleeping in a chair beside my mother on the hard nights, and that Deborah had visited 3 times in 2 years and spent those visits calculating the value of the furniture. Ellen said she would stay out of it. That was fine with me. Then Deborah's mother-in-law, Brenda, began posting vague accusations on the internet. She said some people pretend to love the elderly just to profit from their generosity. Everyone who knew the situation understood exactly who she meant. Ray showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening. I saw his truck idling in the driveway through the peephole and did not open the door. I spoke to him through the wood. He told me the inheritance situation had gone far enough, and that it was time to settle things within the family. I told him it had become a legal matter the moment they started calling my daughter a thief. He laughed and said family issues should stay out of courtrooms. I told him they should have thought of that before the bank withdrawals. There was a pause. He said nothing. Then I heard him walk back to his truck and sit there for a long time before driving away. Sophie came home from school the following week in tears. Deborah had approached her in the parking lot and screamed at her in front of her classmates. She called her a thief. She told her that their grandmother would be ashamed. Sophie sat at my kitchen table and told me she could not keep doing this. She wanted to give the money and the house away if it would make things quiet again. I held my daughter and let her cry. Then I told her that giving would not make Deborah kind. It would only confirm that bullying worked. I told her to hold on a little longer. 2 days before Deborah's so-called family meeting, Sophie found something in my mother's cedar jewelry box. It was a handwritten letter addressed to Sophie. I drove over immediately and read it standing in the kitchen. In her own thin, tilted handwriting, my mother had written that Deborah had borrowed $80,000 over the years and had never repaid a single dollar of it. She wrote that she had become aware someone was taking money from her accounts while she was ill, and that rather than start a fight she no longer had the energy for, she had decided to make things right through the will. She told Sophie to give a letter to me because she knew I would know what to do with it. I took the letter directly to Robert. He said it was significant, not just as evidence of intent, but as a direct account of my mother's thinking at the time she made her final decisions. He had it copied and secured. On Saturday, Sophie dressed carefully. She wore her grandmother's pearl pin on her collar. I drove to the neighborhood and parked several streets away. Robert waited in his car just down the block. Sophie texted me when she arrived. There was a lawyer inside she did not recognize. I told her to stay calm and say nothing she did not mean. Inside the yellow house, Deborah had arranged a room like negotiation. Herself, Ray, Brenda, and a lawyer named Neil, all facing Sophie across the living room. They told her she was too young to manage a house. They told her that taking the inheritance was selfish and wrong. They told her the right thing, the family thing, was to sign the papers they had prepared. Sophie sat with her hands in her lap and said she would not sign anything without her own lawyer present. That was when I walked through the front door. I did not knock. I crossed the room and stood beside my daughter. Deborah told me I had not been invited. I told her my daughter had been, and I was staying. I looked at Neil and told him directly that he was out his depth, that anything Sophie signed in that room without proper independent counsel would not be enforceable anyway. The room shifted. Then my cousin Ellen walked in, expecting a family dinner. When she saw the lawyer and the paperwork, she turned to Deborah with an expression I will not forget. I sent Robert the signal. He knocked on the door and walked in, tall, unhurried, and carrying his own briefcase. He addressed the room simply. He said the will was final and legally unassailable. He said no amount of pressure applied to a young woman without counsel would change that. Neil gathered his papers and left without making eye contact with anyone. Then I opened my briefcase. I laid the bank statements on the coffee table. I identified the 6 withdrawals, the dates, the amounts. I told the room that a forensic handwriting expert had examined the signatures and found them inconsistent with my mother's documented handwriting. I said we had not yet gone to the police, but that the option remained open. The room was completely silent. Then I read from my mother's letter. I read the part about the $80,000 borrowed and never returned. I read the part where she described discovering that money was being taken from her account while she was bedridden. I read it in a steady voice, because my mother deserved to be heard in that room. Brenda stood up without speaking and left. Ray followed her. Neil was already gone. Deborah sat alone on the floor of her mother's living room and began to cry. She said she was broke. She said Ray had left her. She said the bank was going to take her house, and she had nowhere to go. I stood and looked at my sister for a long moment. I felt something, not quite sympathy, but the shadow of it. Then I remembered Sophie crying in a parking lot while her classmates watched. I told Deborah that if she had asked for help honestly, things might have been different. I told her that borrowing money without repaying it, forging a dying woman's signature, and terrorizing a 21-year-old girl were not the acts of someone who deserved mercy. I told her that Robert would be sending a formal letter about the $15,000, and that she had a limited window to return it before we involved the police. She returned every dollar within 10 days. Sophie moved into the little yellow house and made it her own. She kept her grandmother's things exactly where they had always been. She converted one room into a reading room, an armchair by the window, a shelf of mystery novels, good light. We have dinner there every Sunday. The garden needed some attention in the spring, but Sophie learned how to tend it. She is getting good at it. Deborah has not called. I do not expect she will. I have learned things from this that no legal textbook ever taught me. I learned that cruelty disguised as family loyalty is still cruelty. I learned that the most dangerous moment in a fight is when the person you're protecting is too tired to keep going. That is exactly when you have to hold the line for them. And I learned that my mother understood people far more deeply than she ever let on. She did not leave Sophie that house and that money carelessly. She left it with intention, with documentation, and with a letter in a cedar box addressed to the one person she trusted to do something about it. She met me. You do not have to be the loudest person in the room to win. You do not have to match someone's cruelty with your own. You just have to be prepared, stay calm, and never, not for a single moment, let go of your daughter's hand. That is our story. A mother, a daughter, and the quiet, patient truth that finally came home.